Hello again, everyone. Welcome back to Timeless Testimonies. Today's testimony is really good. It's actually continuing on in a testimony found in Volume 5, Testimonies for the Church. Starts on page 654. And the title of the testimony is called The Nature and Influence of the Testimonies. We're in a subsection called Wrong Use of the Testimonies. So, as you may recall from our previous videos, this entire testimony is dealing with kind of helping people to rightly understand what the testimonies are about, what their purpose is, why they were written, how they were written, what is the source of the information contained in the testimonies for the church, and how we're supposed to regard them. So this section, Wrong Use of the Testimonies, is dealing, first of all, I'll tell you, it begins on page 668. And it's dealing with exactly what it says, how they have been, meaning the testimonies, how the testimonies have been used wrongly. And so Ellen is going to be writing about this and giving examples of the wrong use of the testimonies. So as we're reading this section, let's keep that in mind. And then, we can ask ourselves if we've done the same thing. And if we have, then we'll take the correction and we'll change according to how the instruction has been given. Or at least that's what I hope that we will all do. So let's pick up with where we left off from last time. Some who believe the testimonies have erred by urging them unduly upon others. In Volume 1, number 8, is a testimony bearing upon this point. Now in Volume 1, number 8, the testimony that she's referring to, in case anyone wants to go back and read it to kind of get the whole context of that testimony, is called Northern Wisconsin, Volume 1, page 326. So you can go back and check that out for the fuller dealing on that topic. But continuing on, there were some in blank who were God's children, and yet doubted the visions. Others had no opposition, yet dared not take a decided stand in regard to them. Some were skeptical, and they had sufficient cause to make them so. The false visions and fanatical exercises, and the wretched fruits following, had an influence upon the cause in blank to make minds jealous of everything bearing the name of visions. Now, this was written a long time ago, and English has changed a bit over the last however long, 150 years or so from the time this was written, maybe. And the word there, jealous, let's look at what that actually meant in her day. And not that it can't mean the same thing today as well, but we're not in the habit of using it this way in common vernacular. So I looked it up on the CD-ROM for the Ellen White writings, and in the, what year was that, 1828 Webster's Dictionary, the meaning for jealous in this context has this meaning: suspiciously fearful. So keep that in mind. Jealous, suspiciously fearful. So we're going to reread that sentence so we can better understand what's being said here. Some were skeptical, and they had sufficient cause to make them so. The false visions and fanatical exercises, and the wretched fruits following, had an influence upon the cause in blank to make minds jealous, or suspiciously fearful, of everything bearing the name of visions. All these things should have been taken into consideration and wisdom exercised. There should be no trial or labor with those who have never seen the individual having visions, and who have had no personal knowledge of the influence of the visions. Such should not be deprived of the benefits and privileges of the church if their Christian course is otherwise correct. So what she's saying here is that in her day there were people in the movement there that were using Ellen White's writings and the visions that she had kind of to, kind of as the means of dictating who would be accepted into the group of believers and who wouldn't. In other words, if they didn't accept the visions and they just weren't really sure about it, they had never experienced anything to do with them, they'd never seen Ellen White in vision, they had no reason to accept them as true necessarily. They had seen evidences of fanaticism and these terrible fruits following from other situations with similar types of claims, right? So they were suspiciously fearful of anything to do or having to do with visions. And I think several of us can relate to that, maybe even many watching right now, even doubt the visions that Ellen White had. Maybe you even believe that she had a message from God, but yet you're just not sure about the visions. And, the counsel that she gave was that if you have no exposure to the visions, you have no evidence of their truthfulness, that those people should not be deprived of the benefits and the privileges of being among the body of believers. So we're going to keep reading here. Some, I was shown, could receive the published visions, judging of the tree by its fruits. So there were some who had never seen her in vision or, experienced it personally, but when they read the accounts of the vision and the testimonies relating to the message contained in the visions, they were able to accept it because they judged by the fruit of the content and they saw that it was true. And so there were some people who were and are able to accept the visions and the testimonies written and all that based upon the fruits manifested. Others are like doubting Thomas. They cannot believe the published testimonies nor receive evidence through the testimony of others, but must see and have the evidence for themselves. Such must not be set aside, but long patience and brotherly love should be exercised toward them until they find their position and become established for or against. If they fight against the visions of which they have no knowledge, if they carry their opposition so far as to oppose that in which they have had no experience, the church may know that they are not right. And that section is taken from Testimonies for the Church, Volume 1, page 328. So this group of people that Ellen White is referring to here, she equates them with being like doubting Thomas. You know, the story where after Jesus was resurrected and he showed himself to some of the disciples, then Thomas came in and they were telling Thomas about his resurrection and he just didn't believe it. He said, unless I put my hands in the hole, or my fingers in the holes of his hands or side, then I won't believe. So that's what happened. But once he did that, then he did believe. He did not continue to doubt. And that's good. But, Christ told Thomas, hey, because you've touched me and seen me, you believe. Blessed are those who have not seen me and yet believe. So she's saying here that there's a group of people who are like doubting Thomas, and at first they really are suspicious of the visions, but in given time they may come around and that sort of thing. However, she's also saying here that if so long as they're doubting while they've had no experience and they just keep it at that, then they haven't overstepped the bounds of, appropriate conduct or whatever. But if they don't have any experience in it and admittedly so, they would confess that they have no experience for themselves, then how could they really justifiably oppose the visions? So she's saying here that if there's a group of people who don't have any experience in the visions, they don't have any reason to believe based on, visible, tangible evidence aside from the fruits, and there's a class of people who do believe based on that. But say they don't believe at first, but then they go further and more than just not necessarily believing, they start to oppose the work or, set themselves in opposition to it, then the church can know that they're not right. And there's another aspect to this statement that stands out to me too, and that is that there's a period of time in which everyone should be able to, and the period of time is different for everyone, so I just want to say that real quick, but we're all given a period of time, and we're given, however much evidence that should be sufficient for us, both in evidence and sake of time. And it enables us to become firmly established for or against. Then we should be settled, right? There should be a time for the evidence to be given, but then we must become established for or against. And if during that time we're still opposing, then the church can know that we're not right. So we'll continue on here. Some of our brethren had long experience in the truth, and for years had been acquainted with me and my work. They had proved the truthfulness of the testimonies, and had asserted their belief in them. They had felt the powerful influence of the Spirit of God resting upon them to witness to their truthfulness. I was shown that if such, when reproved through the testimonies, should rise up against them and work secretly to lessen their influence, they should be faithfully dealt with, for their course would endanger those who were lacking in experience. That was taken from Testimonies for the Church, Volume 1, page 382. Now notice, this class of people, they were closely related with Ellen in the work. They had all kinds of evidence. They knew her well, and they professed belief and acceptance in the visions and in her inspiration, basically, is what she's getting at. Now, if those people, those of us who have had sufficient evidence, we have become settled, we have professed belief in her inspiration or any point of truth that we've come to accept, and then we receive a reproof or rebuke or we're corrected in some way. If that correction then causes self to rise up, and then we would start opposing the work, even secretly trying to undermine the message of truth, then that's really an awful situation to be in. How does she put it? They should be faithfully dealt with. Now, what does that mean? Faithfully dealt with. Once again, let's just go to some other usages of that phrase, even in Ellen White's own writing. So here's a couple statements that we'll go to. The first one is found in 6th Manuscript Release, page 158, paragraph 1. And here's what it says. One of the points upon which those newly come to the faith will need faithful instruction is on the subject of dress. In the examination of candidates for baptism, this subject should not be lost sight of. Let the new converts be faithfully dealt with. Are they vain in dress? Do they cherish pride of heart? The idolatry of dress is a moral disease. It must not be taken over into the new life. In most cases, submission to the gospel requirements will demand a decided change in the dress. True conversion of the heart will work wonderful changes in the outward appearance. Now there's also a similar statement to this one found in volume 6 of the Testimonies on page 96, paragraph 1. If anyone has the Testimonies but they don't have the manuscript releases and would like to see that statement for themselves. Now, she's saying here that the new converts must be faithfully dealt with on the subject of dress and dress reform. So there's one context of the phrase faithfully dealt with. The next one is found in Testimonies to Ministers, page 128, paragraph 1. And here's how this reads. The test of discipleship is not brought to bear as closely as it should be upon those who present themselves for baptism. It should be understood whether those who profess to be converted are simply taking the name of Seventh-day Adventists, or whether they are taking their stand on the Lord's side to come out from the world and be separate and touch not the unclean thing. When they give evidence that they fully understand their position, they are to be accepted. But when they show that they are following the customs and fashions and sentiments of the world, they are to be faithfully dealt with. If they feel no burden to change their course of action, they should not be retained as members of the church. The Lord wants those who compose His church to be true, faithful stewards of the grace of Christ. Okay, so there's another example of the phrase faithfully dealt with. And here she's talking about that in a much more severe sort of way, I suppose. The first example that I gave with the dress reform, she was just saying that they need to be educated. They need to be brought up to speed on what is acceptable dress and what isn't. Here, she's talking more extreme, and the reason we know is because she's following up with the fact that if they feel no burden to change their course of action, they should not be retained as members of the church. So she's talking disfellowship there, and in relation to being faithfully dealt with. So what does this all mean? Basically, being faithfully dealt with, in the context that Ellen White uses it in her writings, just has the meaning of doing something the right way, in the appropriate manner, according to right principle, or the necessary thing, that sort of thing. The first number of the Testimonies ever published contains a warning against the injudicious use of the light which is thus given to God's people. And she references Testimonies for the Church, Volume 1, page 119. I stated that some had taken an unwise course. When they had talked their faith to unbelievers and the proof had been asked for, they had read from my writings instead of going to the Bible for proof. It was shown me that this course was inconsistent and would prejudice unbelievers against the truth. The testimonies can have no weight with those who know nothing of their spirit. They should not be referred to in such cases. So really take note of that. Have we ever been guilty of this where, we're Seventh-day Adventists and we're talking to someone who isn't a Seventh-day Adventist and they want to understand why we believe something that's unique to our faith. And so, to prove it, maybe we'll bring out one of Ellen White's books and show what she wrote about it. And, with good intentions, of course, and all that, but you can see, hopefully, how inconsistent that is. That's what Ellen White is saying here. They have no reason to put any weight in what she's writing about if they don't already believe that she's an inspired messenger. Now, this is an important principle, and this is one of the things that had me so excited about this testimony, because this is such an important principle. I mean, let's apply this principle now more broadly, okay? Very important. If we are trying to witness to people about Christ as the Messiah, or about victory over temptation, and that scriptures teach us that we can have victory over temption, If we want to share with someone about the state of the dead or whatever, I mean, pick a topic, really. If we want to share anything about our faith with someone who doesn't believe even in the Bible, how would we go about that? Because think about it, there's a lot of people out there that don't believe in the Bible, that don't believe that it's the inspired Word of God, and maybe they don't believe that there's any inspired Word of God. Maybe they're atheists, maybe they're anti-theists, maybe they believe in God, but just not the same God that we do. Even though they might, there's debates over, a lot of people think, oh, well, it doesn't matter what religion you are, it's the same God. So I won't get into that right now, but let's say that you have someone who isn't a Christian, and they don't believe that the Bible is the inspired Word of God. Maybe they have their own inspired writing. Maybe they're Muslim and they have the Quran. Now, Muslims believe in the other prophets too, but their holy book is the Quran. It's not the Bible, it's the Quran. And in order to prove a point to them doctrinally, do you think it will do them any benefit to say, yeah, let me grab my Bible and show them right here it says that, this, that, or the other thing? Well, that's not their holy book. The Quran is. Now, let's say you're familiar with the Quran and you know what it says, and so you can show them from their book. That's a possibility, right? That's one way that maybe you could share with them the point that you're trying to get across. But what about someone else, maybe a Buddhist or anybody who doesn't believe in the Bible, religious or irreligious? How do you get across truth? What determines what truth is? Do you know? I mean, this is so important. And I'm excited to be able to recommend you to some other videos. And we'll have a link here. What is truth? You should check that out to get more information there. But think about it. We can't use something to prove a point that basically is able to be disbelieved. You know what I mean? We can't take a writing that we believe to be true and use it to try to prove our point to someone who doesn't believe in that writing. We have to have another way. We have to know the foundation of truth. So I highly recommend that video. Now I'm going to continue on with this for the sake of time. Other warnings concerning the use of testimonies have been given from time to time as follows. Some of the preachers are far behind. They profess to believe the testimony borne, and some do harm by making them an iron rule for those who have had no experience in reference to them, but they fail to carry them out themselves. They have had repeated testimonies which they have utterly disregarded. The course of such is not consistent. That was Testimonies for the Church, Volume 1, page 369. So let's say there's a preacher, and he's really hammering the testimonies, and he's getting on to the people in his congregation or her congregation. And this preacher is really hammering home the points brought out in the testimony. But that person isn't even living them out in their own life. That's going to be really discouraging to people for a few reasons. And one of those reasons is the spirit that is being manifested in that action is not the same spirit that governs the writings of inspiration. It's not the same spirit manifested by God. So if they're saying that these testimonies are inspired by God, and they're really hammering home that you need to be doing this or you need to not be doing that, and but they're basically being hypocritical. They're doing exactly the things that they're saying you shouldn't do. It's going to really discourage people because they're going to see the inconsistency of the Spirit manifested. It's going to weaken their faith and maybe turn them completely off altogether. So that's another example of a wrong use of the testimonies. We can't be using them to beat people up and then neglecting to follow the counsel in our own lives. And just to be clear, I don't think we should use them to beat people up regardless of anything to do in how we're living our own lives. But the next statement, I saw that many have taken advantage of what God has shown in regard to the sins and wrongs of others. They have taken the extreme meaning of what has been shown in vision, and then have pressed it until it has a tendency to weaken the faith of many in what God has shown, and also to discourage and dishearten the church. That was Testimonies for the Church, Volume 1, page 166. The enemy will seize upon everything which he can use to destroy souls. Testimonies have been born in favor of individuals occupying important positions. They commence well to lift the burdens and act their part in connection with the work of God. But Satan pursues them with his temptations, and they are finally overcome. As others look upon their wrong course, Satan suggests to their minds that there must be a mistake in the testimonies given for these persons, else these men would not have proved themselves unworthy to bear a part in the work of God. Thus, doubts arise in regard to the light that God has given. That which can be said of men under certain circumstances cannot be said of them under other circumstances. So just to pause real quick and kind of highlight some of the points that we've read so far. Basically, there were times when Ellen White had written testimonies in favor of a certain person filling a position, whether that was in ministry or whether that was in the Health Institute or what have you. And at the time that the commendation was written, it was true. There was great potential for the person to do a mighty work for God in whatever position they were going to occupy. Now, it doesn't mean that we don't still have free choice. I mean, look at Lucifer. He was created perfect. He was doing a wonderful work. He was one of the highest angels. He was a covering cherub. He was right in the presence of the Most High. But he chose to rebel. He allowed dissatisfaction and selfishness to rise up in his heart. And so then he was no longer fit to be there and to occupy that position. Now, it didn't mean that God was wrong in providing that position for Lucifer when Lucifer was fit for the position. And it doesn't mean that the testimonies weren't true and accurate when written in regard to people promoting or kind of suggesting that they would be good for a certain position. I'm going to continue reading, and then there's some more that I want to bring out here. Men are weak in moral power, and so supremely selfish, so self-sufficient, and so easily puffed up with vain conceit, that God cannot work in connection with them, and they are left to move like blind men, and to manifest so great weakness and folly, that many are astonished that such individuals should ever have been accepted and acknowledged as worthy of having any connection with God's work. This is just what Satan designed. Okay, so Satan wants people to think, how could that person ever have been suggested for this position? Because it'll lessen their confidence in the testimonies and in the wisdom of God. So I'll continue on. This was his object from the time he first specially tempted them to reproach the cause of God and to cast reflections upon the testimonies. Had they remained where their influence would not have been specially felt upon the cause of God, Satan would not have beset them so fiercely, for he could not have accomplished his purpose by using them as his instruments to do a special work. That was Testimonies for the Church, Volume 3, page 469 and 470. So what's she saying here? Well, basically, these people, one of the reasons why they were so severely attacked and singled out by Satan is because they were in a position where by causing them to fall and to turn away, he could do far more damage. The damage would be more widely felt. I mean, if he causes someone to stumble and fall who has no influence, it's sad. It's a really sad thing. But their influence is really just kept with their own life or maybe one or a few other people around them. But take someone who's prominent in the work, at the head of the work even. If the devil can focus his efforts on them and cause them to fall and to reproach the cause of God, then the influence is widely felt. And so naturally, he's going to focus his efforts there. So we shouldn't be surprised when we see someone high up with a lot of responsibility. I'm not going to say authority, because that's a whole different topic, but a lot of responsibility when they're tempted and tried and they give in. We should be praying for these people and trying to do everything that we can to lift them up and to help them overcome their temptations and to enable them to not only not lose out for themselves, but to protect the people who are under their influence, basically. So that's the testimony, wrong use of the testimonies. I hope it was helpful to see how, people in her day actually used the testimonies in various ways that were wrong, and how we can apply some of those principles even more broadly. For example, trying to use the Bible to prove a point to someone who doesn't believe that the Bible is the inspired Word of God. We have to do better than that. We want and need to reach the whole world. How are we going to reach the whole world when a great majority of the world doesn't believe in the Bible, the inspired books contained in the Bible? We've got to learn how to reach people where they're at and not just expect, you've got to be on the same page as me, then I can show you what this book says, and then you'll know that you need to believe that. Nope. We've got a higher calling than that. And it's possible to do, and by the help of God, each one of us who have a burden for souls will be seeking to learn and understand these principles so that we can apply them to the work as we take it up. Thank you again for joining me. I hope you're all blessed.